Two prisons. No windows. No touch. No sound. One buried in the Rocky Mountains. The other hidden at the edge of the Pacific. Both built to erase human presence. This is not myth, it's documented reality. Before we enter, subscribe now. These stories are buried on purpose, and once you hear them, you won't see justice the same way again. If you want real, fact-based prison documentaries that don't flinch, hit subscribe and stay with us. This is Inside the Concrete Tomb. In the American prison system, control is rarely improvised. It is designed, calculated, poured into concrete long before the first inmate arrives. Nowhere is that more evident than in two facilities separated by more than 1,000 miles but united by philosophy, ADX Florence and Pelican Bay State Prison. Both prisons were built in response to fear. Not public fear but institutional fear, the fear of losing authority inside prison walls. Each represents a moment when the state decided that traditional incarceration was no longer enough, and that total isolation was the only remaining tool. ADX Florence sits in the high desert of Colorado, surrounded by open land and distant mountains. On paper, it is the most secure prison in the United States. Federal officials describe it as a place for inmates who are too dangerous to be housed anywhere else. Its architecture reflects that belief. Cells are poured concrete. Doors are solid steel. Windows are narrow slits designed to show only sky, not horizon, preventing prisoners from orienting themselves to the outside world. Pelican Bay, by contrast, is hidden in California's far north, surrounded by forests and fog. Its isolation is geographic as much as architectural. Built during a surge of prison violence in the late 1980s, Pelican Bay was designed specifically to neutralize prison gangs. At its core is the Security Housing Unit, the SHU, a place where inmates could be confined alone for decades without ever committing a new crime. While ADX Florence and Pelican Bay operate under different systems, federal versus state, their blueprints share a common logic: eliminate human variables. At ADX Florence, prisoners spend roughly 23 hours a day alone. Meals are slid through slots. Recreation happens in enclosed concrete pens often referred to by inmates as dog runs. Contact with other humans is minimized to the point of abstraction. Even correctional officers limit conversation. Everything is predictable. Movement is choreographed. Surveillance is constant. Pelican Bay's SHU follows a similar rhythm, though its origins are different. Where ADX Florence was built to contain individuals convicted of extreme crimes, terrorism, organized crime, high-profile violence, Pelican Bay's SHU was built to contain influence. Prison officials were not trying to punish past acts alone. They were trying to sever command structures they believed controlled violence across California's prisons. In both places, isolation is not a temporary measure. It is the environment. The cells themselves tell the story. At ADX Florence, each cell contains a concrete bed, a desk molded from the floor, a sink with regulated water pressure, and a toilet controlled by guards. At Pelican Bay's SHU, cells are similar: concrete, sealed, sterile. In both facilities, sound behaves differently. Silence is never complete, yet noise is never meaningful. Echoes replace conversation. The human voice loses relevance. Officials argue this design saves lives. They point to reduced assaults, fewer riots, and increased institutional stability. And statistically, they are often correct, at least in the short term. Violence inside these units is rare. But safety achieved through deprivation raises a different question. What happens to the people inside? At ADX Florence, many inmates are held under administrative maximum status, meaning their confinement is not solely based on sentence length but on perceived risk. Some have spent decades without physical contact with another prisoner. Even religious services are often conducted through closed-circuit television. Human presence becomes symbolic rather than real. Pelican Bay's SHU once operated under an even harsher framework. Inmates could be held indefinitely based on gang validation, a process that did not require criminal conviction. Some prisoners entered the SHU in their 20s and emerged in their 40s or 50s, having spent most of their adult lives alone. Both prisons claim to offer review processes. Both claim isolation is necessary. Both insist these environments are humane. Yet former inmates from both facilities describe eerily similar experiences: loss of time perception, emotional numbing, difficulty forming thoughts, the sense that reality itself becomes thin. At ADX Florence, some inmates reported talking to themselves simply to confirm they still existed. At Pelican Bay, others described staring at walls for hours, not out of boredom but because thinking felt dangerous. What makes this comparison unavoidable is intent. ADX Florence was built to ensure no inmate could ever exert power again. Pelican Bay was built to break collective power already in motion. One targets individuals. The other targeted systems. Both succeeded, partially. But success came with consequences that architects never fully accounted for. Because when you design a space that removes choice, contact, and unpredictability, you don't just control behavior. You reshape identity. You create a population that survives through detachment. And once detachment becomes instinct, it does not disappear when doors open. This is the concrete tomb, not because it kills the body but because it slowly buries the self. And this is only the beginning. Because once we move beyond architecture, we have to confront what life inside these places actually does, to minds, to power, and to the future of incarceration itself. Time behaves differently inside extreme isolation. At ADX Florence, days are engineered to feel identical. That is not an accident, it is policy. The Bureau of Prisons believes predictability reduces violence, anxiety, and resistance. Every movement, every sound, every interaction is regulated down to the minute. When routine replaces uncertainty, control becomes easier to maintain. A typical day begins without an alarm. Lights do not dramatically switch on. They simply remain. Prisoners wake when they wake, often disoriented, unsure whether they slept for hours or minutes. There is no natural light cycle to guide the body. The narrow window, angled toward the sky, offers no sunrise, no sunset, no weather context. Just light or darkness. Breakfast arrives through a slot in the steel door. No words are exchanged. Food is standardized, nutritionally sufficient, intentionally bland. At ADX Florence, meals are designed not to comfort but to sustain. Taste is irrelevant. What matters is consistency. After the tray is retrieved, silence returns. Prisoners spend most of the day alone with their thoughts. Some read obsessively. Others pace measured steps across concrete floors, counting movements to create structure. Many develop rigid personal routines, push-ups at exact intervals, reading the same pages repeatedly, memorizing legal documents, rewriting letters they may never send. Recreation, when it happens, is solitary. Inmates are escorted, often in restraints, to outdoor enclosures sometimes described as concrete boxes with open tops. The sky is visible. Air moves. But there is no grass. No equipment. No other people. Recreation is not about enjoyment. It is about controlled exposure to space. Conversation with staff is minimal by design. Officers are trained to remain professional, brief, emotionally neutral. The fewer variables introduced, the safer the environment remains. In this system, nothing is personal. Now shift to Pelican Bay State Prison, and the similarities are immediate, but the atmosphere is different. Pelican Bay's security housing unit was never designed for federal-level terrorists or internationally known criminals. It was designed to contain networks. And that purpose shapes daily life in subtle but profound ways. Like ADX Florence, SHU prisoners live alone. Cells are nearly identical in size and structure. Meals arrive through slots. Recreation occurs in small concrete yards with high walls and partial open ceilings. But unlike ADX Florence, Pelican Bay's SHU once operated under a psychological condition more corrosive than predictability: uncertainty. For years, prisoners in the SHU did not know when, or if, they would ever leave. At ADX Florence, many inmates know their sentence length even if it is long. At Pelican Bay, confinement was often indeterminate. Release depended not on time served or behavior, but on administrative decisions tied to validation and debriefing. This uncertainty transformed daily life into a prolonged negotiation with the system. Every interaction carried potential consequences. Mail could be evidence. Books could be suspicious. Conversations, however limited, could be interpreted. Even silence could be misread. Prisoners learned to monitor themselves constantly, not just to survive isolation but to avoid extending it. Where ADX Florence stripped individuality through routine, Pelican Bay stripped security through ambiguity. Food was another point of contrast. While nutritionally adequate, meals at Pelican Bay were often cited by inmates as inconsistent in quality and quantity. Complaints about spoiled food, small portions, and punitive meal adjustments circulated widely. Hunger became both physical and symbolic, one of the reasons it later became a tool of resistance. Social contact in the SHU was nearly non-existent. Yet unlike ADX Florence, where isolation was largely solitary by design, Pelican Bay created parallel isolation. Prisoners could sometimes hear others through walls or vents. Knocks, taps, coded noises, these became lifelines. Communication evolved not through speech but rhythm. This distinction mattered. At ADX Florence, isolation aimed to erase influence entirely. At Pelican Bay, isolation unintentionally preserved it, just in altered form. Influence moved quietly, patiently, through systems designed to stop it. Psychologically, both environments produced damage, but in different ways. ADX Florence often created emotional flattening. Prisoners described becoming numb, detached, almost mechanical. Feelings dulled because there was nowhere to express them. Time blurred into repetition. Identity narrowed. Pelican Bay produced hypervigilance. Prisoners remained mentally alert, scanning for threats not from other inmates, but from administrative interpretation. Stress accumulated differently, less numbness, more tension. Anxiety became constant. Former inmates from both facilities later described similar symptoms. Difficulty sleeping, memory lapses, heightened sensitivity to sound, emotional withdrawal, trouble forming relationships. But many also noted a difference in what broke first. At ADX Florence, boredom and monotony eroded the self. At Pelican Bay, fear of permanence did. Neither system was designed for healing. Both assumed that stability was the same as safety. What neither fully accounted for was the long-term cost of removing all meaningful human interaction. Humans do not regulate themselves in isolation, they fragment. They adapt in ways that make survival possible but reintegration difficult. And that fragmentation does not stay behind bars. As years passed, evidence mounted. Psychologists warned that long-term solitary confinement caused irreversible harm. Courts began questioning its constitutionality. Advocacy groups documented case after case of men deteriorating in silence. Yet both prisons remained operational. Because despite the damage, both institutions served a purpose the system still relied on. They made problems disappear. The question no longer was whether ADX Florence or Pelican Bay worked. The question was what they worked toward. And whether a society willing to bury people alive in concrete could still claim moral authority over the concept of justice. Isolation was supposed to end power. That was the theory behind both ADX Florence and Pelican Bay State Prison. Remove communication, eliminate hierarchy, and influence collapses. No meetings. No group movement. No shared space. Without contact, authority should dissolve. It didn't. What happened instead was something far more unsettling. Power adapted. At ADX Florence, federal officials believed they were housing individuals whose influence could not be neutralized anywhere else. Terrorist leaders, organized crime figures, mass killers, inmates accused of orchestrating violence even while incarcerated. The assumption was simple: if these men could not speak, they could not lead. But leadership does not always require conversation. Sometimes it survives through reputation alone. Many prisoners at ADX Florence entered the facility already known, by staff, by other inmates, by the media. Their names carried weight long before the cell doors closed. Inside a system where prisoners rarely saw each other, identity became mythological. Who someone was mattered more than what they could do. Inmates described learning about others not through interaction, but through fragments, court filings, media reports, rumors carried by staff unintentionally. A name overheard. A transfer noticed. A silence that suggested status. Influence at ADX Florence became symbolic. A prisoner did not need to issue orders. Their existence alone represented an idea: resistance, extremism, defiance, notoriety. That symbolism mattered, especially in a place where meaning was scarce. When the environment strips away stimulation, the mind latches onto narratives. Pelican Bay's SHU operated differently, but arrived at a similar outcome. Where ADX Florence targeted individuals, Pelican Bay targeted affiliation. Validation placed inmates into categories that followed them everywhere. Labels mattered more than actions. A person could go years without a disciplinary infraction and remain confined solely because of who the system believed they were connected to. This created a strange inversion of power. In general population, influence often comes from physical presence. Numbers, intimidation, visibility. In the SHU, influence came from endurance. The longer someone remained without debriefing, the more authority they gained. Survival itself became proof of loyalty and strength. Over time, this produced a hierarchy based not on violence, but on resistance to the system. Men who refused to cooperate, who endured isolation year after year, became anchors of identity for others. They were not issuing commands, but their decisions shaped behavior across facilities. If someone held out, Others followed. If someone broke, consequences rippled outward. Pelican Bay unintentionally created a leadership filter. Only the most disciplined survived long-term isolation intact. Those individuals emerged with sharper ideological clarity and deeper credibility. In trying to erase influence, the system distilled it. Communication found a way. At Pelican Bay, prisoners developed methods of contact that exploited the prison's own routines. Legal mail became a conduit, not because it was abused but because it was protected. Messages were slow, indirect, and carefully worded. Language evolved. Meaning hid between lines. Months could pass between exchanges, yet coordination still occurred. This wasn't chaos. It was patience. ADX Florence, with its even stricter controls, limited such coordination more effectively. But even there, influence survived in smaller forms. Legal challenges were coordinated indirectly. Ideas circulated through filings, appeals, and shared legal precedents. Prisoners learned from one another without ever meeting. Both institutions underestimated something fundamental. Power does not require proximity. It requires belief. Belief that endurance means something. Belief that resistance is observed. Belief that silence is not surrender. The state's response to this realization was inconsistent. At ADX Florence, authorities doubled down on individualization. Movement became even more restricted. Communication more regulated. Privileges tightly controlled. The goal was to reduce even symbolic influence by shrinking identity itself. At Pelican Bay, the response was more conflicted. Officials recognized that validation-based isolation was creating legal and ethical problems. Lawsuits mounted. Public scrutiny increased. Yet the fear of releasing perceived leaders remained. This tension produced paralysis. Some prisoners were transferred out of the SHU after decades. Others remained. Criteria changed, but uncertainty lingered. The system could not fully abandon a tool it no longer trusted, but still relied on. What both prisons revealed was a contradiction at the heart of modern incarceration. The system treats power as something external, commands, meetings, actions. But inside extreme isolation, power becomes internalized. It lives in perception, identity, and narrative. You cannot handcuff that. And the cost of trying is steep. As isolation intensified, so did psychological strain. Some prisoners internalized the system's logic entirely, becoming hyper-controlled, rigid, emotionally inaccessible. Others turned inward, constructing elaborate mental worlds to survive. A few broke completely. Yet even breakdown carried meaning. It became evidence used by both sides. Officials pointed to instability as justification for continued isolation. Prisoners pointed to it as proof of harm. The prisons became self-reinforcing machines. Control created damage. Damage justified more control. And outside the walls, the public saw almost none of it. ADX Florence remained largely mythologized, a place for monsters, distant and abstract. Pelican Bay slowly entered public consciousness, but often framed through gang narratives rather than human cost. What was missing from both stories was the same thing isolation removed from prisoners: context. Why these systems existed, what they replaced, and whether the alternatives were ever seriously considered. Because once power survives isolation, the rationale for isolation itself begins to collapse. If you cannot eliminate influence, if you cannot rehabilitate, if you cannot reintegrate, then what exactly is the concrete tomb preserving? That question would force policymakers, courts, and society itself to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about prisons but about punishment. And the answer would not come from inside the cells. It would come from the outside when the damage could no longer be denied. For decades, extreme isolation existed in a legal gray zone. Courts had long accepted the idea that prisons required broad discretion to maintain safety and order. Judges were reluctant to interfere in what they viewed as specialized, high-risk environments. As long as food, shelter, and basic medical care were provided, conditions were rarely scrutinized in depth. ADX Florence and Pelican Bay thrived inside that deference. But as years turned into decades, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Not evidence of riots or escapes, but evidence of damage. Psychological evaluations. Medical reports. Patterns too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The law finally began to catch up. At the federal level, challenges to conditions at ADX Florence emerged slowly and cautiously. Many of the inmates housed there were convicted of crimes that generated little public sympathy. That mattered. Courts are human institutions and context shapes attention. When plaintiffs were labeled terrorists or mass killers, arguments about mental health and humane treatment struggled to gain traction. Still, cracks appeared. Defense attorneys began presenting expert testimony from psychiatrists and neurologists describing the effects of long-term isolation. They argued that confinement at ADX Florence was not merely restrictive, it was debilitating. Prisoners were not just being separated from others, they were being separated from stimuli essential to cognitive function. Judges listened but carefully. Most rulings stopped short of declaring the conditions unconstitutional. Instead, courts focused on procedural issues, review mechanisms, access to medical care, opportunities for progression out of extreme isolation. The message was subtle but clear. Absolute isolation without meaningful oversight was legally vulnerable. Pelican Bay faced a more direct reckoning. Unlike ADX Florence, which housed a relatively small and specialized population, Pelican Bay's SHU affected thousands over time, many of whom had never committed violent acts inside prison. Some were validated based on association, possession of literature, or confidential informants whose credibility could not be tested. That distinction mattered in court. Civil rights attorneys argued that indefinite SHU confinement violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. They pointed to men held in solitary for 10, 20, even 30 years without a single serious disciplinary infraction. They documented rates of mental illness far exceeding those in general population. Medical experts testified that prolonged isolation caused predictable and severe psychological harm. Memory impairment, emotional dysregulation, psychosis, depression, suicidal ideation. These were not rare outcomes, they were systemic. What shifted the legal landscape was not just the data but its consistency. Different experts, different cases, same conclusions. In one pivotal moment, a federal judge acknowledged what had long been argued but rarely stated plainly. There are limits to how long a human being can be isolated without suffering serious harm. That recognition did not dismantle Pelican Bay overnight, but it changed the conversation. Settlement negotiations followed. California agreed to revise its gang validation policies, limit indeterminate SHU confinement, and create step-down programs that allowed inmates to transition out of isolation without debriefing. Thousands of prisoners were reviewed. Many were transferred. Some were released into general population for the first time in decades. The SHU was no longer a permanent destination. ADX Florence did not experience such sweeping reform. Federal courts remained cautious, often emphasizing national security and institutional safety. But even there, incremental changes appeared. Review processes became more formalized. Mental health screening improved. Opportunities for progression, while limited, were clarified. Still, the core structure remained intact. The difference between the two prisons now reflected a broader truth about American incarceration. State systems bend before federal ones do. Pelican Bay's reforms were driven in part by public pressure. Media coverage, hunger strikes, advocacy campaigns. ADX Florence, shielded by secrecy and national security framing, remained largely insulated from similar scrutiny. Yet the legal arguments converged. Across courtrooms, a central question emerged. Is isolation a management tool, or a form of punishment in itself? If it is punishment, then it must meet constitutional standards. If it causes predictable psychological damage, then intent becomes irrelevant. These arguments forced courts to confront a deeper issue. The American legal system traditionally evaluates punishment based on proportionality and intent, but isolation complicates both. It is not always imposed for past actions. Often, it is imposed for perceived future risk. And its effects compound over time in ways no sentence length fully captures. A year in solitary is not the same as a year in general population. Courts began to acknowledge this distinction, quietly, cautiously. At Pelican Bay, that acknowledgement changed lives. At ADX Florence, it planted seeds that had not yet fully grown. What neither system could escape was the growing consensus among medical professionals. Long-term solitary confinement is not a neutral condition. It alters the brain. It reshapes behavior. It leaves marks that do not fade when doors open. The law does not move quickly, but it moves in response to record. And the record now contained thousands of pages documenting the human cost of the concrete tomb. The question facing the system was no longer whether isolation worked. It was whether a democracy could justify a practice that produced harm so reliably, and still call it correction. That question would not be answered by a single ruling or reform. It would unfold over years through policy shifts, public awareness, and the lived experiences of those who survived these places. Because once the courts acknowledge harm, responsibility follows. And responsibility demands something the system has always struggled to provide: an alternative. ADX Florence and Pelican Bay were built on the same promise: that total isolation could solve what the justice system could not control. One targeted the individual. The other targeted the network. Both succeeded, briefly. And both failed in ways that can't be undone. The concrete walls did not erase violence, ideology, or influence. They reshaped them. They buried men alive in silence and called it security. And long after the doors opened, that silence followed them home. The real question this story leaves us with is not how dangerous these prisons are, but what kind of society needs them. If this documentary gave you a deeper understanding of power, punishment, and the hidden cost of isolation, subscribe for more fact-based crime documentaries that go where most cameras never go. This was Inside the Concrete Tomb. And some prisons were never meant to be survived.